After her mom died at 11:47 p.m. on a rainy Tuesday, he refused to pay his pregnant wife's hospital bills exactly 16 hours later, then left with his mistress before the sun set on his mother-in-law's grave. But he had no idea his pregnant wife had just inherited a $100 billion fortune that would make his betrayal the most expensive mistake in modern history. Daniel Whitmore had rehearsed his exit speech for weeks, but his pregnant wife Olivia never imagined he'd deliver it in a hospital room while she sat surrounded by medical bills she couldn't pay and a baby she couldn't protect alone. But the USB drive her dying mother had pressed into her palm contained account numbers that would shift the balance of power so dramatically that Daniel's cruelty would become his prison. His mistress Jessica wore a smile of victory as she wrapped her arms around Daniel's waist in the hospital parking lot, but neither of them noticed Olivia watching from the fourth-floor window, her hand pressed against the glass, her mother's final words echoing in her mind like a prophecy about to fulfill itself. The pregnancy test results, the funeral expenses, the mounting debt, the public humiliation. Daniel had calculated every pressure point to break her, but he'd forgotten to calculate what happens when a broken woman inherits enough money to buy his entire existence and reshape it into something unrecognizable. What crushing move would Olivia make first? Would she expose him immediately? Wait until his world felt secure before pulling the foundation out from under him? Or craft something so perfectly devastating that he'd spend years watching everything he valued crumble, while understanding exactly why it was happening? The rain hadn't stopped since her mother took her last breath, but Olivia barely noticed the water streaming down the hospital windows as she signed the stack of medical documents the nurse had placed before her. Her hand shook, not from grief alone, though that sat heavy in her chest like stones, but from the baby kicking against her ribs, reminding her that life continued, even when it felt like the world should pause. Daniel stood across the room, his back rigid, his phone pressed to his ear, but his voice carried that particular tone he used when he wanted her to overhear without admitting he wanted her to overhear. "I know, Jess. I'll handle it today. She's vulnerable right now. It's the perfect timing." Olivia's pen froze mid-signature, but she didn't look up. 7 months of pregnancy had taught her that some pains you absorbed silently, but this one felt different, sharper, more intentional. Her mother's funeral was scheduled for tomorrow morning, but the hospital bills from her mother's 3-week ICU stay were due today. And Daniel had made his position clear over breakfast. He wasn't paying for a woman who wasn't even his real family. The nurse, Teresa, according to her badge, glanced between them with the practiced neutrality of someone who'd witnessed too many family fractures in sterile rooms, but her eyes lingered on Olivia's belly with something that looked like worry. "Mrs. Whitmore, the total comes to $47,000. We'll need payment arrangements by 5 p.m. today, or we'll have to send this to collections." Daniel ended his call with a sharp tap and turned, but his expression held none of the warmth Olivia remembered from their wedding day 3 years ago. "Olivia and I need to discuss something privately." Teresa nodded, but her hand briefly touched Olivia's shoulder before she left, a gesture so small yet so loaded with meaning that Olivia nearly broke right there. The door clicked shut, but the silence that followed felt like a living thing pressing down on her lungs. "I'm leaving," Daniel said, and there was no preamble, no gentle lead-in, just the cold delivery of a fact. "I've been seeing Jessica for 8 months. She's pregnant too, 5 months along. I'm choosing her." The words hung in the air like smoke, but Olivia's brain struggled to process them in order. Jessica, 8 months, pregnant, choosing her. Each word was a separate explosion, but together they created a devastation so complete that Olivia couldn't find her breath. "My mother just died," she whispered, and it was the only thing her mind could grasp. 16 hours ago, I held her hand. "I know the timing isn't ideal," Daniel interrupted, but his tone suggested he found the timing perfectly ideal, strategically ideal. But I can't keep pretending, Olivia. You've been a financial drain for years. Your mother's medical bills, your pregnancy complications, the experimental treatments you insisted she needed. Do you know what you've cost me? Olivia's hand moved to her belly instinctively, protectively, but her voice came out steadier than she felt. This is your baby too. Is it? Daniel's smile was cruel, calculated. You've been so obsessed with your mother's care that I barely remember the last time we were intimate. How do I know that baby is even mine? The accusation hit like a physical blow, but Olivia recognized it for what it was, a justification he'd constructed to make his betrayal feel righteous. She'd seen him do this in business deals, rewriting history to cast himself as the victim, the reasonable party, the one forced into difficult decisions by others' failures. There's been no one else, she said quietly, but she wasn't defending herself. She was simply stating a fact to someone who'd already decided facts didn't matter. Daniel pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, but the gesture was theatrical, rehearsed. I'm not paying your mother's hospital bills. I'm not paying for your pregnancy care. And I'm certainly not paying for a child I'm not sure is mine. These are divorce papers. Sign them and I'll cover the lawyer fees. Refuse, and I'll make this as expensive and ugly as possible. He dropped the envelope on the table beside her mother's funeral program, but the juxtaposition felt deliberate. He wanted her to see how little her grief mattered to him. Through the window, Olivia could see the parking lot 4 floors below, but her eyes caught movement near Daniel's black Porsche. A blonde woman in a red dress stood beside the car, her hand resting on her own pregnant belly, her smile visible even from this distance. She's waiting for you, Olivia said, and it wasn't a question. Jessica understands ambition, Daniel replied, moving toward the door. She doesn't drag me down with constant needs and medical emergencies. She's a partner, not a burden. The door opened, but Daniel paused in the threshold, and what he said next would replay in Olivia's mind for months afterward. Your mother spent her entire life poor, and she died poor despite all the money I poured into keeping her alive an extra few weeks. She taught you to be weak, to be dependent, to expect men to rescue you. I need a woman who stands on her own. Sign the papers, Olivia. It's over. The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than a slam would have, but Olivia remained frozen in her chair, her hand still pressed against her belly, her mother's final words suddenly roaring back into her consciousness with the force of a freight train. 20 hours earlier, the deathbed. Her mother's hand had been so cold, but her grip remained surprisingly strong as she pulled Olivia close, her voice barely a whisper beneath the oxygen mask. In my purse. USB drive. Red one. Password is your birthday. Mom, save your strength, Olivia had pleaded, but her mother's eyes held an urgency that cut through the morphine haze. Listen to me, baby. I lied to you your whole life. About who I was, about who your father was, about what I had. Each word cost her mother visible effort, but she pushed through. I wasn't always poor. I made choices to hide, to protect you, until the time was right. Mom, you're not making sense. The USB drive, her mother insisted, her grip tightening. Don't open it until Daniel shows you who he really is, not who he pretends to be, who he really is. When he thinks you have nothing, when he thinks you're broken, that's when you'll know. Promise me you won't look until then. Olivia had promised, but she hadn't understood, and now, sitting in the hospital room with divorce papers beside her mother's funeral program and Daniel's mistress waiting in the parking lot below, she finally did. Her hand trembled as she reached into her purse, but the USB drive was exactly where her mother had left it, a small red rectangle that looked utterly ordinary, completely unremarkable. Her mother's laptop was still in the car, but the hospital had a business center on the second floor, and Olivia moved through the hallways like a ghost, her pregnant belly leading the way, her mind still struggling to process the complete destruction of her life in the span of 16 hours. The business center was empty except for a young man working on a spreadsheet who barely glanced up when Olivia entered, but she chose the computer in the corner, as far from observation as possible. Her fingers shook as she inserted the USB drive, but the password prompt appeared immediately, demanding her birthday. 04151992. The screen went black for 3 seconds, but when it returned, Olivia found herself staring at a document titled, "For Olivia When You're Ready to Know." Her mother's words filled the screen in a letter that must have taken weeks to write, but Olivia's eyes caught on specific phrases that rewrote her entire understanding of reality. "I was born Catherine Elizabeth Thornton, but I became Catherine Miller to hide from your father's family. Your father was Harrison Thornton III, heir to the Thornton technology empire, worth $247 billion at the time of his death. We fell in love in secret, but his family threatened to destroy me if I didn't disappear. I was pregnant with you when I ran. I've been managing the fortune remotely through offshore accounts and shell corporations for 30 years, growing it from the $100 million settlement they paid me to disappear into something much larger. The current value, as of last month, is $103.7 billion. See, it's all yours now. Every penny, every company, every property, every investment." The letter continued for pages, but Olivia's vision blurred as the numbers and names swam together, and her breath came in short gasps that had nothing to do with the baby pressing against her lungs. Her mother, Catherine Miller, the woman who'd worked double shifts at the diner, who'd clipped coupons and bought day-old bread, who'd apologized for being a financial burden during her cancer treatment, had been managing $103.7 billion in secret. But the letter's final section cut deepest of all. "I stayed hidden because I wanted you to know what real love looks like versus what people pretend is love when they think you have money. I watched Daniel court you, marry you, slowly reveal his true nature. I tried to warn you gently, but you needed to see it yourself. Now you will. Now, when he thinks you're at your weakest, he'll show you exactly what he values. And it's not you, baby. It's never been you. Use this fortune wisely, not for revenge alone, though I won't judge you for that. Use it to build the life you deserve, to raise my grandchild in truth rather than in hiding, to be the woman I trained you to be without you realizing I was training you at all. The attorney contact is below. His name is Robert Chen. He's been managing everything in secret for 30 years, waiting for this moment. Call him. Today, don't wait. The moment Daniel reveals himself is the moment you begin rebuilding. I love you more than money, more than comfort, more than safety. That's why I lived poor and died poor, so you could learn those same values. Now you'll have both the values and the resources. Make me proud." "Mom," Olivia sat in the business center chair, her pregnant belly pressed against the desk, tears streaming down her face in silence. But beneath the grief and shock, something else was stirring, something cold, something calculating, something that felt remarkably like her mother's spirit, settling into her bones and whispering, "Now, show him, show them all." The attorney's office occupied the entire 42nd floor of the Thornton building downtown, but Olivia didn't notice the irony until Robert Chen mentioned it during their meeting 3 hours after she'd fled the hospital. "Your grandfather built this building in 1987. Your father proposed to your mother on the roof. She came back here only once after running, to set up the trust that would eventually come to you." Robert Chen was 73 years old, but his mind was sharp as surgical steel, and his eyes held the particular gleam of someone who'd been waiting decades to execute a carefully laid plan. "Your mother was one of the most brilliant financial minds I've ever encountered. She turned $100 million into $103.7 billion through strategic investments in technology, Pharmaceutical startups, real estate, and renewable energy. She never touched the principal for personal use. Every dollar of growth was reinvested. Why? Olivia's voice cracked. Why live like that when she had all this? Because she was preparing you, Robert said simply. She told me once, my daughter will inherit more than money. She'll inherit wisdom, resilience, and perspective. She'll know what it's like to worry about grocery bills and medical debt. She'll understand what most billionaires never do, what life costs for normal people. She wanted you to have empathy before you had power. The conference room overlooked the city where Olivia had struggled to pay rent for 3 years. But from this height, everything looked small, manageable, conquerable. Daniel left me today at the hospital, 16 hours after my mother died. He has a pregnant mistress. He refused to pay my mother's medical bills or my pregnancy expenses. He suggested my baby might not be his. Robert's expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on his pen. Your mother predicted this timeline with eerie accuracy. She told me, he'll wait until he thinks she's completely broken, until she has no money, no support, no options. That's when he'll strike, because that's when he'll feel safest. She was right. What do I do? Olivia asked, and it wasn't really a question. It was an invitation for Robert to help her channel the rage currently burning through her chest like acid. Robert opened a leather portfolio, but inside were documents that represented 30 years of patient preparation. Your mother left you detailed instructions for various scenarios, but they all boil down to one core principle. Make it educational. Don't just destroy him. Teach him why he's being destroyed. Make him understand step by step what he gave up, what he underestimated, and what his cruelty cost him. He slid a document across the table titled Operation Revelation, Strategic Response to Daniel Whitmore, but the level of detail suggested her mother had been planning this for years. Olivia scanned the pages, but each section built upon the last in a progression so perfectly calibrated that she could almost hear her mother's voice explaining it. Phase 1. Silent acquisition purchase. Controlling interests in Whitmore Consulting, Daniel's company, through shell corporations. Acquire the building where Jessica lives. Buy the hospital's outstanding debt, including Catherine Miller's bills. Secure ownership of Daniel's favorite restaurant, his gym, his country club membership. Phase 2. Subtle pressure. Begin restricting Daniel's business operations through corporate policy changes. Increase rent on Jessica's apartment to unsustainable levels. Create unexplained delays in Daniel's consulting contracts. Ensure his professional reputation begins to suffer from mysterious client complaints. Phase 3. The revelation schedule. A board meeting at Whitmore Consulting to announce the ownership change. Time the revelation for maximum impact. Suggested 6 months after abandonment. Ensure Jessica and all professional contacts are present. Deliver the truth in a public setting where Daniel's reaction becomes permanent record. Phase 4. Reconstruction offer. Daniel, a choice. Public accountability or private settlement. Use media coverage to highlight treatment of pregnant wife after mother's death. Redirect all energy toward building something meaningful with the fortune. Focus on the baby, on healing, on becoming the mother your mother trained you to be. But it was the handwritten note at the bottom, added in her mother's shaky final handwriting, that made Olivia's breath catch. Don't lose yourself in revenge, baby. Use the first 3 phases to buy yourself time to heal, to prepare, to become strong. But remember, the real victory isn't destroying him. It's building a life so magnificent that his absence from it becomes his greatest punishment. Make him irrelevant, not ruined. That's how queens operate. Olivia pressed her hand against her belly, but the baby kicked as if in agreement, as if her mother's spirit lived on in the tiny body growing inside her, waiting to be born into a completely different world than the one Olivia had prepared for. "I want to do it," she told Robert. "All of it, exactly as she planned." Robert smiled, but it was the smile of a man who'd been waiting 30 years to watch a carefully constructed domino chain finally begin to fall. "Then let's begin. Your mother already purchased the hospital's debt portfolio 3 months ago when she knew her time was limited. As of this morning, you own all $47,000 of her medical bills, and by extension, Daniel owns you nothing, but he doesn't know that yet. Let him think he won. Let him celebrate. Let him build his new life with Jessica on the foundation of your supposed destruction. Then, when he feels safest, when he's convinced he made the right choice, that's when we act." 3 months later, Daniel's life had never felt better, but the nagging sensation that he'd overlooked something important kept surfacing at odd moments, like now sitting in the conference room at Whitmore Consulting, while his lawyer explained why 3 major clients had suddenly terminated their contracts. "It doesn't make sense," Daniel insisted, but his confidence was cracking at the edges. "Hamilton Corp has used our services for 8 years. Thompson Industries just renewed last quarter. Vanguard Financial specifically requested me for their merger advisory. Why would they all leave simultaneously?" His lawyer, Gerald Morrison, looked uncomfortable but professional. "They cited strategic differences and company policy changes. But Daniel, I'm hearing rumors. Questions about your character, something about abandoning a pregnant wife after her mother's death." "That's—" Daniel started, but Jessica interrupted from her seat beside him. "That's his bitter ex-wife spreading lies," Jessica said smoothly, her hand resting on her 7-month belly. Olivia couldn't handle that Daniel chose someone more compatible. She's trying to ruin him out of spite. Gerald didn't look convinced, but he continued. "There's also the matter of the building ownership. Your lease renewal came back denied. The new owner is exercising their right to decline tenant extensions. You have 60 days to relocate the entire company." "Who bought the building?" Daniel demanded. "A shell corporation called Thornton Holdings. I can't find much information about them, but they've been quietly acquiring properties all over the city. Very aggressive, very secretive." Daniel's phone buzzed with a message from his landlord, the owner of the luxury apartment he shared with Jessica. Rent increase from $4,000 per month to $15,000 per month, effective immediately. His jaw tightened, but Jessica was already reading over his shoulder, her face pale. "That's illegal," she breathed. "They can't just—" "They can if there's a clause in the lease allowing market rate adjustments," Gerald said grimly. "Did you read your rental agreement carefully?" But Daniel's mind was elsewhere, tracing a pattern he didn't want to see, yet couldn't ignore. The client losses, the building ownership, the rent increase, the mysterious complaints about his character, they all started around the same time, right after Olivia had disappeared from his life completely. He'd tried calling her once 3 weeks after leaving, but curiosity more than concern drove him. The number had been disconnected. Her social media accounts had vanished. Even her few friends claimed they hadn't heard from her. It was as if she'd evaporated from existence, but Daniel had been too busy celebrating his freedom and planning his new life with Jessica to worry about where his ex-wife had gone. Now, sitting in his conference room while his professional life crumbled around him, Daniel felt the first cold finger of genuine fear trace down his spine. "Find out everything you can about Thornton Holdings," he told Gerald. "Every property they own, every business they've acquired, every connection they have. I want to know who I'm dealing with." 6 months after the abandonment, Olivia stood in the penthouse nursery, her newborn daughter, Catherine, named for the grandmother who would never meet her, sleeping peacefully in her arms. But the view from the window overlooked the entire city, including the building where Daniel's company now struggled to survive on the 15th floor of a much less prestigious address. Robert Chen had executed her mother's plan with surgical precision, but Olivia had made modifications, softer in some ways, harder in others. She'd bought Daniel's company debt but hadn't foreclosed. She'd increased his costs but hadn't made them impossible. She'd damaged his reputation but hadn't destroyed it completely. Every pressure she applied was calibrated to make him struggle, to make him question, to make him understand what it felt like to watch your world slowly constrict while being powerless to stop it. But the revelation, phase 3 of her mother's plan, was scheduled for today, and Olivia had spent the morning preparing her appearance, her words, and her emotional defenses for the confrontation she'd been both dreading and anticipating for 6 months. Catherine stirred in her arms, but her tiny fist gripped Olivia's finger with surprising strength, and in that grip, Olivia felt her mother's presence so strongly it almost knocked her breath away. "Your grandmother wanted you to grow up knowing what matters," she whispered to her sleeping daughter. "Love matters, truth matters, character matters. Money is just a tool. It's what you do with it that defines you." Her phone buzzed with a message from Robert. "Board meeting starts in 1 hour. Daniel confirmed attendance. Jessica will be there too. She's listed as his business partner now. Everything is ready." Olivia kissed her daughter's forehead, but the nanny, Patricia, a kind woman in her 50s who'd been vetted extensively by Robert's team, appeared in the doorway with a gentle smile. "I'll watch her, Mrs. Thornton. You go do what you need to do." The name still felt foreign, Mrs. Thornton, but Robert had insisted she reclaim her legal family name, to own her heritage rather than hide from it. Olivia Victoria Thornton, heir to the Thornton fortune, mother to Catherine Elizabeth Thornton, widow to no one who mattered. The drive to Whitmore Consulting's new location took 40 minutes, but Olivia spent the time reviewing her mother's notes one final time, though she'd memorized them weeks ago. The handwritten additions in the margins revealed her mother's personality, sarcastic observations, strategic suggestions, and occasional expressions of love that made Olivia's throat tighten. One note in particular stood out. "Remember, baby, the goal isn't to hurt him. It's to free yourself from caring whether he hurts or not. True power is indifference. Make him irrelevant, then walk away and build something beautiful." The reception area of Daniel's new office was shabby compared to the prestige of his old building, but the receptionist looked stressed, overworked, underpaid. She barely glanced at Olivia before waving her toward the conference room. "Board meeting is starting. They're waiting for the owner's representative." Olivia was the owner's representative, but she didn't correct the receptionist, and instead moved silently down the hallway, her designer heels clicking on cheap linoleum that Daniel would have scorned 6 months ago. Through the conference room glass, she could see 12 people seated around a table. Daniel at the head, Jessica beside him with her hand possessively on his arm, Gerald the lawyer shuffling papers nervously, and 9 other board members who looked confused about why they'd been called here. Robert Chen stood at the presentation screen, but his eyes met Olivia's through the glass with a question. "Ready?" She nodded once, and Robert opened the door, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades of legal experience. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. The owner of Whitmore Consulting has decided to make a personal appearance today to discuss the company's future direction." Daniel frowned, but his confusion was evident. "I thought this was about the financing restructure. Who bought my company debt? I've been trying to find out for months." "I did," Olivia said, stepping into the conference room, and the silence that followed her entrance was so complete that she could hear Jessica's sharp intake of breath from across the table. Daniel's face went through a remarkable transformation. Shock, disbelief, confusion, fear, anger, denial, all in the span of 3 seconds, but he recovered with the smooth professionalism he'd always prided himself on. "Olivia, what are you doing here?" "I'm the majority shareholder of Whitmore Consulting," she said calmly, taking the seat at the opposite end of the table from Daniel, but Robert distributed folders to each board member that contained documentation supporting her claim. Through a series of acquisitions over the past 6 months, I now own 73% of this company's outstanding debt, which I converted to equity ownership last week. I also own the building where Jessica lives, the hospital where my mother died, the country club where you proposed to me, and approximately 40 other properties and businesses that have influenced your life in various ways over the past few months. Jessica's face had gone pale, but her hand tightened on Daniel's arm. "This is insane. You can't just—" "I can," Olivia interrupted gently, "and I did. My mother, Catherine Miller, though her real name was Catherine Elizabeth Thornton, left me an inheritance of $193.7 billion when she died 6 months ago. The same night you told me she'd taught me to be weak and dependent. The same night you refused to pay her hospital bills. The same night you introduced me to the concept of being abandoned while 7 months pregnant." The board members were flipping through their folders rapidly, but the documentation was irrefutable. Purchase agreements, transfer documents, ownership certificates, all bearing Olivia's legal name and the date stamps that proved every acquisition had occurred after Daniel had left her. Daniel's professional mask was cracking, but rage was seeping through. "You've been sabotaging me. The client losses, the rent increases, the complaints about my character, that was all you." "Actually, the character complaints were genuine," Olivia corrected. "Turns out that abandoning your pregnant wife after her mother's death doesn't play well in professional circles. I didn't have to manufacture that damage. I just stopped protecting you from the natural consequences of your choices. The financial pressures, though, yes, those were intentional, strategic, educational." "Educational," Daniel's voice rose. "You've been destroying my life to teach me a lesson?" "No," Olivia said softly, but her eyes were hard as diamonds. "I've been teaching you what it feels like to watch everything you value slip away while being unable to stop it. To struggle with bills you can't pay. To feel the walls closing in. To understand that the person you trusted most was actually calculating your destruction. How does it feel, Daniel? Does it feel like that hospital room felt 6 months ago when you handed me divorce papers instead of support?" Jessica stood abruptly, but her pregnancy made her movements awkward, ungainly. "You're a vindictive—" "Sit down, Miss Parker," Robert said coldly. "You're here as a courtesy because you're listed as Mr. Whitmore's business partner, but this doesn't concern you. Though I should mention that the building you're living in is also owned by Mrs. Thornton, and your lease expires in 30 days with no option for renewal." Jessica sat down slowly, but her eyes held the first glimmer of understanding that she'd picked the wrong side of a war she hadn't known existed. Daniel's hands were shaking, but he pressed them flat against the table. "What do you want, Olivia? Money? An apology? Revenge? What's the end game here?" Olivia stood, but she moved to the window overlooking the city, the same view she had from her penthouse, but from this angle, at this height, everything looked different. "I want you to understand what you threw away. Not the money, you never knew about that, so you can't mourn it. But me. The life we could have built. The daughter you'll never meet. The family you destroyed because you confused net worth with human worth." She turned back to face him, but her voice remained steady, controlled. "My mother spent 30 years teaching me that character matters more than cash, that love matters more than luxury, that integrity matters more than image. You spent 3 years teaching me the opposite, that I was only valuable as long as I was convenient, that loyalty was conditional, that vows meant nothing when better options appeared." "I didn't know," Daniel whispered, but it wasn't an apology. It was a lament for what he'd lost without realizing he'd lost it. "And that's exactly the point," Olivia said. "You loved me when you thought I was poor, except you didn't love me, you tolerated me. You calculated my value based on what I cost you versus what I provided you. The moment the scales tipped toward cost, you left. But if you'd stayed, if you'd honored your vows, if you'd supported me through my mother's death, If you'd been excited about our baby instead of questioning her paternity, you would have discovered that your wife was worth $103.7 billion. The number hung in the air like a bomb, but every board member in the room was doing rapid calculations about what Daniel had walked away from, and the horror on their faces was almost comical. "But here's what you really lost," Olivia continued, and her hand moved unconsciously to her chest, above her heart. "You lost a woman who would have given you everything, not because of money, but despite it. You lost a partner who understood struggle because she'd lived it. You lost a daughter who'll grow up knowing her father chose someone else. You lost integrity, honor, loyalty, and love. And you traded it all for what, exactly? A mistress who attached herself to you when she thought you were successful. A relationship built on betraying someone else. A life that requires you to justify your cruelty by pretending I deserved it." Daniel's face had gone gray, but Jessica was crying silently, her hand no longer on his arm, but wrapped protectively around her own belly, as if she suddenly understood she'd built her life on someone else's ruins. "I'm not here to destroy you," Olivia said finally, and she returned to her seat. But her posture was relaxed, powerful, complete. "I'm here to offer you a choice. Option 1. I liquidate this company, foreclose on every debt you owe, and use my resources to ensure you struggle for the next decade the way you intended me to struggle. Option 2, you sign over full ownership of Whitmore Consulting to me, you publicly acknowledge what you did 6 months ago, and you start over somewhere else with the understanding that your reputation will follow you, but your debts won't." "That's not a choice," Daniel said bitterly. "That's extortion." "No," Robert interjected. "That's mercy. Option 1 is justice. Option 2 is mercy with accountability. Mrs. Thornton is offering you more compassion than you offered her, which should tell you something about the character difference between you." Gerald, the lawyer, leaned forward. "Daniel, take option 2. You can't win this fight. The documentation is airtight, the financial position is insurmountable, and frankly, the moral position is non-existent. Sign the papers, make the statement, and rebuild somewhere that doesn't have Thornton fingerprints all over it." But Olivia wasn't finished. She pulled out her phone, but the image she displayed made Daniel's breath catch. A photo of baby Catherine sleeping peacefully in her nursery. Her tiny face a perfect blend of Olivia's features and undeniably Daniel's bone structure. "This is Catherine Elizabeth Thornton," Olivia said quietly. "Your daughter, born healthy despite the stress you caused during pregnancy. She has your eyes, your chin, your stubborn little frown when she's concentrating. The paternity test you demanded? I had one done voluntarily. 99.9% match. She's yours, Daniel, and you'll never meet her because you walked away when you thought we were worthless, and you don't get to come back now that you know what we're worth." The photo disappeared from her screen, but the image remained burned into Daniel's retinas, and for the first time since Olivia had entered the room, she saw genuine grief cross his face, not for what he'd lost in terms of money, but for what he'd lost in terms of meaning. "I'll sign," he whispered. "Good," Olivia said, and she stood. But this time she moved toward the door, her part in this confrontation complete. "Robert will handle the paperwork. You have 48 hours to make your public statement. I'll leave the wording to you, but it needs to acknowledge the timeline of events honestly. After that, you're free to start over. I won't pursue you further, but I also won't help you. You'll succeed or fail based entirely on your own merit, which is something you never allowed me to do." She paused at the door, but her final words were directed at Jessica, not Daniel. "Ms. Parker, you're welcome to stay in your apartment rent-free until your baby is born. I'm not punishing an innocent child for their parents' choices. But after that, you're on your own. Build carefully. The foundation you chose is weaker than you realized." 1 year later, Catherine's first birthday party was a modest affair by billionaire standards, but Olivia had specifically requested simplicity. Close friends, Patricia the nanny, Robert and his wife, and a handful of people who'd supported her during the darkest months of her life. The penthouse nursery was decorated with balloons and streamers, but Catherine was more interested in the wrapping paper than the gifts, her delighted laughter filling the space with a joy so pure it made Olivia's chest ache. Robert found her on the balcony after the cake had been served, but his expression was serious despite the celebration inside. Daniel's public statement ended up being quite thorough. He took full accountability, admitted the timeline, acknowledged his cruelty. His consulting career is effectively over. He's working as a mid-level analyst at a firm in Boston now. Jessica left him 4 months ago. She's raising their son alone in Portland. Olivia absorbed this information with less satisfaction than she'd expected to feel, but her mother's words echoed in her mind. Make him irrelevant, not ruined. That's how queens operate. And the Thornton Foundation? She asked, changing the subject to what actually mattered now. Robert's expression brightened immediately. Fully operational. Your mother's fortune is being deployed exactly as you planned. Scholarships for single mothers, medical debt relief programs, support systems for people going through grief and financial crisis simultaneously. The first round of beneficiaries received their letters last week. The gratitude responses are overwhelming. Olivia nodded, but her eyes drifted to the city below, where thousands of people struggled with the same challenges she'd faced a year ago. The intersection of grief, financial stress, betrayal, and fear. My mother gave me $103.7 billion, but she also gave me perspective. I know what it's like to sit in a hospital room, pregnant and alone, surrounded by bills I couldn't pay and grief I couldn't process. Every person we help knows I'm not helping them from a place of pity. I'm helping them from a place of understanding. Your mother would be proud, Robert said softly. I hope so, Olivia replied. But Catherine's laughter drifted through the balcony doors, pulling her attention back to what mattered now. Not the past, not revenge, not even justice. Just this moment, this child, this life she'd rebuilt from ruins. Inside, Patricia was holding Catherine up to see the city lights, but the little girl's eyes were wide with wonder at the view. Olivia joined them, taking her daughter into her arms, but Catherine immediately grabbed for her mother's necklace, a simple gold chain holding her grandmother's wedding ring, the only jewelry Catherine Elizabeth Thornton had kept when she'd run away 30 years ago to protect her unborn daughter from a family that valued money over love. Your grandmother was the richest poor woman I ever knew, Olivia whispered to Catherine. And now you'll be the poorest rich girl, because I'm going to raise you exactly the way she raised me, with values before valuables, with character before capital, with love before luxury. Catherine responded by grabbing Olivia's nose and giggling, completely unconcerned with philosophical proclamations. But that was exactly the point. She was 1 year old, healthy, happy, loved, surrounded by wealth but protected from its corrupting influence by a mother who understood that the greatest inheritance wasn't money at all. 5 years later, the investigative journalist's article hit the internet at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, but by noon it had been shared 847,000 times, and by evening it was the top trending topic on every social media platform. The headline read, "The pregnant wife he abandoned inherited 100B. Here's what she did with it." Olivia didn't read the article immediately, but Catherine, now 6 years old and remarkably perceptive, noticed her mother's phone exploding with notifications during breakfast. "Why is everyone talking about you, Mama?" "Because people are interested in unusual stories," Olivia explained. But she silenced her phone and focused on the more important task of ensuring Catherine ate her vegetables instead of just the pancakes. Later that evening, after Catherine was asleep, Olivia finally read the article that had captured the internet's fascination. The journalist had traced her entire story, from Daniel's abandonment to the inheritance, to the calculated confrontation to, most importantly, the 5 years of systematic philanthropy that followed. The Thornton Foundation had deployed $12 billion in aid during those 5 years, but the article highlighted specific stories. The single mother whose medical debt had been erased, allowing her to keep her home and raise her children. The widow who'd received a scholarship to finish her nursing degree after her husband's death. The pregnant teenager whose hospital bills had been paid anonymously, allowing her to focus on her baby instead of bankruptcy. The cancer patient whose experimental treatment had been funded when insurance denied coverage. But the article's conclusion was what made it go viral. Olivia Thornton could have used her fortune to destroy the man who betrayed her. Instead, she used it to ensure no other woman would face the same impossible choice between medical care and financial survival, between grief and bills, between pride and desperation. Daniel Whitmore's life was changed by his choice to abandon his pregnant wife. But thousands of other lives were changed, for the better, by what that pregnant wife chose to do with the fortune he never knew existed. The comment section was predictably divided, but one thread caught Olivia's attention. Someone had tracked down Daniel's current situation and posted an update. He was remarried, working a stable but unspectacular job, living in a modest house in the suburbs of Boston. He'd never publicly responded to questions about Olivia, never tried to contact Catherine, never attempted to justify or apologize beyond that initial public statement 5 years ago. He made himself irrelevant, Olivia murmured, but there was no triumph in her voice, just recognition that her mother's strategy had worked exactly as planned. Her phone rang, but Robert's name appeared on the screen. "Have you seen the article?" "Just finished reading it," Olivia confirmed. "The response has been overwhelming. We've received 12,000 new donation requests in the past 12 hours, but we've also received pledges from other wealthy individuals who want to fund similar programs. Your story is inspiring a movement." Olivia moved to the window of her study, but the view overlooked not the city lights this time, but the private garden where Catherine played every afternoon, a space filled with flowers that Catherine helped plant, vegetables they grew together, and a small statue of a woman that Catherine called Grandma Catherine, though she'd never met the woman who'd orchestrated this entire transformation. "My mother didn't give me $103.7 billion for revenge," Olivia said quietly. "She gave it to me as a responsibility, to prove that money is just a tool. It's what you build with it that matters. Daniel taught me what selfish love looks like. My mother taught me what selfless love accomplishes. I know which legacy I want Catherine to inherit." "Your mother chose well," Robert said. "Not everyone would have responded to betrayal by helping others facing similar betrayals. Most people would have chosen destruction." "Most people didn't have Catherine Elizabeth Thornton as a mother," Olivia replied. "She spent 30 years teaching me in secret, preparing me for a moment I didn't know was coming. The fortune was just the tool. The lesson was the gift." After ending the call, Olivia pulled out the letter her mother had written, the one she'd read that first day in the hospital business center 5 years ago, but the one she returned to whenever doubt crept in. The final paragraph still made her breath catch. "Someday Catherine will ask you about her father. Tell her the truth, that he made a choice based on limited information, and that choice revealed his character. But also tell her that his choice freed you to become who you were always meant to be. Don't teach her to hate him. Teach her to learn from him. Teach her that people reveal their priorities through their actions, and that the most important legacy isn't what we accumulate, but what we contribute. You were my contribution, baby. Catherine is yours. The fortune is just the amplifier. Make it count." Olivia pressed the letter against her heart, but through the study door she could hear Catherine talking in her sleep. Garbled 6-year-old words about playgrounds and ice cream and a math test she was worried about, but also about Mama and Grandma Catherine and helping people. The fortune her mother had hidden for 30 years was being deployed exactly as intended, not to destroy one man who deserved it, but to help thousands who deserved better. And the daughter Daniel had walked away from was growing up watching her mother transform grief into generosity, betrayal into purpose, and abandonment into a foundation that would help people for generations. Catherine stirred in her bedroom down the hall, but Olivia moved quietly to check on her, and the sight of her sleeping daughter, safe, healthy, loved, unburdened by the drama that had preceded her birth, was worth more than $103.7 billion could ever buy. Daniel Whitmore had refused to pay his pregnant wife's hospital bills and left with his mistress, unaware she'd just inherited a $100 billion fortune. But what Olivia had done hadn't crushed him in the way he'd feared. It had crushed his ego, his pride, his professional reputation, but it had left him alive, functional, capable of starting over. Because that was the difference between destruction and displacement, between revenge and irrelevance, between punishment and purpose. Queens didn't waste energy destroying pawns. They built empires that made the pawns' kingdoms irrelevant by comparison. And as Olivia kissed her daughter's forehead and whispered, "Sweet dreams, baby," she knew with absolute certainty that she'd done exactly what her mother had trained her to do. Not just survive betrayal, but transcend it completely. The fortune was real, but the victory was deeper. And that made all the difference. 12 years later, the auditorium at Thornton Academy fell silent as 17-year-old Catherine Thornton stepped up to the microphone, but her mother watched from the third row with a mixture of pride and bittersweet recognition. Catherine had her father's confidence, her grandmother's intelligence, and something entirely her own that Olivia was still learning to name. "My college essay prompt asked me to write about someone who changed my life," Catherine began, but her voice carried the steady composure of someone who'd grown up watching her mother navigate complexity with grace. "Most students write about parents, teachers, coaches. I'm going to tell you about someone I never met." Olivia's breath caught, but she already knew where this was going. "My grandmother, Catherine Elizabeth Thornton, died 12 years before I was born, but she's the most influential person in my life," Catherine continued. But the audience, parents, teachers, fellow students, leaned forward collectively. She was a billionaire who lived like she was poor. She was brilliant but worked double shifts at a diner. She had every advantage but chose hardship, and she did it all to teach her daughter, my mother, a lesson that would eventually teach me one too. Catherine pulled out a worn USB drive, the same red one Olivia had inserted into that hospital computer 12 years ago, but Catherine had asked to see it on her 16th birthday, and Olivia had given it to her, along with the full story of what had happened before she was born. "My grandmother wrote a letter that I've read maybe 100 times, Catherine said. In it, she explained why she hid her fortune, why she struggled when she didn't have to, why she watched her daughter marry someone who would eventually betray her. She wrote, "I want Olivia to know what real love costs, what real sacrifice means, what real character looks like when there's nothing to gain from showing it." The auditorium was absolutely silent, but Olivia could see other parents shifting uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing the implicit critique of how they'd raised their own children in privilege without perspective. "My mother was abandoned while pregnant with me," Catherine said, and there was no embarrassment in her voice, no shame, just factual clarity. "My biological father walked away because he thought we were worthless financially. He missed my entire childhood because he calculated wrong. And my grandmother had planned for exactly that scenario, not because she was psychic, but because she understood human nature well enough to predict it." Catherine paused, but her eyes found Olivia's in the audience, and the love in that gaze made Olivia's throat tighten. "I grew up wealthy, but I grew up working. I have a trust fund I can't access until I'm 25, but I've had a job since I was 14. I live in a penthouse, but I volunteer at the homeless shelter every Saturday. I attend this prestigious academy, but I spend my summers working at the Thornton Foundation, processing applications from people who remind me that I could have been them, that I would have been them if circumstances had been slightly different. She held up the USB drive like a talisman. My grandmother's letter ends with instructions for my mother, but there's a section she wrote specifically for me, knowing I'd eventually read it. She wrote, "Catherine, if you're reading this, it means your mother succeeded. It means she took pain and turned it into purpose. Your job now is to take purpose and turn it into legacy. Don't just manage the fortune, multiply the impact. Don't just help people, empower them to help themselves. And never, ever forget that you could have been born into the struggle you're now helping others escape." Catherine's voice thickened slightly, but she pushed through. "I never met my grandmother, but I know her through every choice my mother makes, through every scholarship awarded, every medical bill erased, every family supported through impossible circumstances, through the way my mother raised me to understand that privilege is responsibility, that wealth is stewardship, that character is the only currency that actually matters." She stepped away from the microphone briefly, but when she returned, her composure had fully returned. "My college essay is about my grandmother, but it's really about the lesson she taught across generations, that the most valuable inheritance isn't money, it's values, that the most important legacy isn't what you accumulate, it's what you contribute, that the truest measure of success isn't what you achieve for yourself, but what you enable others to achieve for themselves." The applause started slowly, but it built to a standing ovation that Catherine accepted with graceful humility before returning to her seat. And Olivia found herself crying silently in the audience, not from sadness but from the overwhelming recognition that her mother's 30-year plan had succeeded beyond anything Catherine Elizabeth Thornton could have imagined. After the ceremony, Olivia found Catherine in the hallway outside the auditorium, but her daughter was surrounded by classmates asking questions, offering congratulations, admitting they'd never known the full story behind the Thornton Foundation they'd all heard about, but never really understood. When the crowd finally dispersed, Catherine collapsed into her mother's arms with the exhaustion of someone who'd just revealed something deeply personal to hundreds of people. "Was that okay? Was I too honest? Did I embarrass you?" "You were perfect," Olivia whispered fiercely. "Your grandmother would have been so proud. I'm so proud." They walked to the parking garage together, but Catherine's silence suggested something was weighing on her mind, and Olivia had learned over 17 years to wait for her daughter to formulate her thoughts rather than rushing to fill the quiet. "Mom," Catherine finally said as they reached the car, "do you ever wonder about him? About my biological father?" It was the question Olivia had been preparing for since Catherine was old enough to understand that most families looked different than theirs, but the actual asking of it still felt like a small earthquake. "Sometimes," Olivia admitted, because she'd promised herself she'd never lie to Catherine about this. "Not because I miss him or regret what happened, but because I wonder if he ever thinks about what he missed. If he ever sees news about the foundation and realizes you're the daughter he walked away from. If he's ever sorry not just for losing the money, but for losing you." Catherine processed this as they got into the car, but she didn't speak again until they were halfway home. "I looked him up last year. I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure how you'd react." Olivia's hands tightened on the steering wheel, but she kept her voice neutral. "What did you find?" "He's remarried, has 2 younger kids, half-siblings I'll never meet, works a normal job, lives a normal life. His LinkedIn profile is sad, honestly, not because he's struggling, but because he's just ordinary. Middle management, suburban house, generic life. And I realized Grandma Catherine was right. The punishment wasn't destroying him. It was making him irrelevant while we became extraordinary. How do you feel about that? Olivia asked carefully. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, but when she spoke, her voice held a clarity that reminded Olivia so much of her own mother. It was almost supernatural. I feel like I dodged a bullet, like Grandma Catherine orchestrated things so that his absence from my life was actually a gift. Because if he'd stayed, I would have grown up watching you compromise yourself to make a marriage work with someone who didn't value you. I would have learned that love means accepting less than you deserve. I would have inherited his values instead of Grandma's. She turned to look at Olivia directly. Instead, I grew up watching you turn pain into power, betrayal into philanthropy, abandonment into abundance. I learned that character is a choice, that resilience is a skill, that generosity is a legacy. I learned these things because he left, and I wouldn't trade that education for anything, not even for the fantasy of having a father who actually deserved me. Olivia had to pull over because tears were blurring her vision, but Catherine unbuckled her seatbelt and reached across the console to hug her mother, and they sat there on the side of the road while traffic rushed past, holding onto each other the way they'd been doing since Catherine was born. Not because they needed saving, but because they'd built something together that was worth protecting. 2 days later, the email arrived in Olivia's inbox at 9:47 a.m. on Thursday, but the sender's name made her freeze, Daniel Whitmore. She stared at it for 5 full minutes before opening it, but when she finally did, the message was shorter than she'd expected. Dear Olivia, I saw the video of Catherine's speech. Someone at the academy posted it online, and it's been shared widely enough that it reached me here in Boston. I'm not writing to ask for anything. I'm not writing to apologize, though I am sorry, more sorry than words can convey. I'm writing because your daughter's words made me realize something I should have understood 17 years ago. I didn't just walk away from money, I walked away from the most important thing I could have been, a father to an extraordinary human being. Catherine's intelligence, her compassion, her clarity of thought, they're obvious, even through a 15-minute speech. And I have no claim to any of it because I wasn't there for any of it. You raised her alone. You raised her with values I clearly lacked. You raised her to be someone who sees wealth as responsibility rather than entitlement, and you did it all while dealing with grief, betrayal, and challenges I can't even imagine. I'm not asking to meet her. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking for anything except for you to know that I understand now what I threw away. Not the fortune. I never knew about that, so I can't claim to mourn it. But the chance to be Catherine's father, the chance to watch her grow into whoever she's becoming, the chance to be part of something meaningful instead of just comfortable. My life is fine. That's the worst part. It's completely fine. I'm not struggling. I'm not suffering. I'm just ordinary. And watching Catherine's speech made me realize that ordinary is its own kind of tragedy when you had the opportunity to be part of something extraordinary and you walked away from it. Tell Catherine if you think it's appropriate that her biological father is proud of who she is, even though he has no right to be. Tell her that I understand why she doesn't need me, and that understanding that is probably the most mature I've ever been. I won't contact you again. This isn't the opening move in some attempt to reconnect. It's just a closing statement, the one I should have made 17 years ago, but didn't have the character to deliver. I hope you're happy, Olivia. From what I saw in that speech, you've earned it in ways I never understood. Daniel Olivia read the email 3 times, but each reading produced a different emotion. Anger, sadness, pity, relief, vindication, emptiness. She saved it to a folder labeled Catherine's History, knowing that someday her daughter might want to read it, but also knowing that whether she did or not, it wouldn't change the fundamental truth of their lives. They'd built something extraordinary in Daniel's absence, not despite it. That evening, Catherine found Olivia in the study, but her mother was staring at the photograph on her desk. A picture of 3 generations of Thornton women, that didn't actually exist because Catherine Elizabeth Thornton had died before her granddaughter was born. Yet somehow the spirit of all three of them lived in the Foundation's work, in Catherine's character, in the legacy they were building together. "You okay, Mom?" Catherine asked, settling into the chair across from the desk. "Your biological father sent me an email," Olivia said, because she'd learned from her own mother that honesty was the foundation of trust. "He saw your speech online. He wanted me to know that he understands what he missed." Catherine's expression didn't change, but she absorbed this information with the analytical precision of someone who'd inherited multiple forms of intelligence. "Do you want me to read it?" "Only if you want to," Olivia said. "It doesn't change anything. It doesn't erase what he did or create obligations where none exist. It's just closure, I suppose. The acknowledgement we never got 17 years ago." "Forward it to me," Catherine said after a moment. "I'll read it when I'm ready. But Mom, whether he understands what he missed or not, it doesn't actually matter. Because what we built together, what Grandma Catherine set in motion, what the Foundation accomplishes every day, none of that required him. In fact, all of that happened because he left. His absence created the space for us to become who we are." Olivia felt tears threatening again, but Catherine continued, her voice taking on the philosophical tone she used when she was working through complex ideas. "I've been thinking about Grandma Catherine's strategy. She could have revealed the fortune immediately. She could have protected you from Daniel's betrayal. But she didn't, because she understood that you needed to experience that betrayal at your lowest point to truly understand human nature. She let you suffer so you could learn something essential about character, loyalty, and love." "That's a harsh teaching method," Olivia said quietly. "But an effective one," Catherine countered. "If you'd known about the money before he left, you'd always wonder if he would have stayed out of genuine love or financial calculation. This way, you know with absolute certainty what he valued. And I know with absolute certainty that I was raised by someone who understands struggle, not just observes it from a distance." She leaned forward, but her eyes held a wisdom that seemed older than her 17 years. "I'm applying to college next year. I'm going to study economics and social policy. I'm going to learn everything I can about wealth distribution, systemic poverty, and how to maximize philanthropic impact. And I'm going to do all of this because my grandmother lived poor to teach my mother a lesson, and my mother used that lesson to teach me one. That's a legacy worth more than $100 billion, Mom. That's a legacy that changes generations." 6 months later, the Thornton Foundation annual gala. The ballroom glittered with the kind of wealth that used to intimidate Olivia. But after 12 years of navigating these spaces, she'd learned that money was just another tool, powerful when used correctly, meaningless when hoarded incorrectly, and surprisingly easy to redirect toward meaningful purposes when you understood leverage. Catherine stood beside her mother at the podium, but this year's gala was special. It marked the 12th anniversary of the Foundation's establishment and the announcement of a new initiative that Catherine had designed herself. The Thornton Future Fund, Catherine announced to the assembled donors, politicians, and philanthropists, will provide full scholarships, housing, and mentorship to 100 students per year who come from single-parent households where that parent was abandoned during pregnancy or early childhood. The audience shifted, but Catherine's voice remained steady. "My mother was abandoned while 7 months pregnant with me. My grandmother lived in poverty while secretly managing billions. I grew up understanding that circumstances don't define you, but they do shape you. The Future Fund will identify students who've been shaped by adversity but not broken by it, and will provide them with every resource necessary to transform their potential into reality." She paused, but her next words carried weight that made several people in the audience reach for tissues. "This program is named for the future my biological father couldn't see when he walked away. It's funded by the fortune he didn't know existed, and it will create opportunities for children whose parents made different choices than mine did. Parents who stayed, who struggled, who sacrificed everything to raise their children alone. We're not judging the absent parents. We're empowering the present ones. The standing ovation lasted 3 full minutes, but Olivia watched her daughter accept it with grace and humility, and she felt her mother's presence so strongly in that moment that she almost turned to look for her. "You did it, Mom," Olivia thought. "You turned 100 million into 103.7 billion, into something that will help people for generations. You turned betrayal into purpose, pain into power, abandonment into abundance. And Catherine, our Catherine, is going to take it even further." After the gala, Olivia and Catherine stood on the balcony of the ballroom, but the city lights below represented millions of people living lives they'd never know, fighting battles they'd never see, struggling with challenges the Thornton Foundation was designed to address. "Do you think Grandma Catherine knew it would turn out like this?" Catherine asked. "I think she hoped," Olivia said. "But I also think she understood that the best plans leave room for improvisation. She set things in motion, but we're the ones who turned it into this." Catherine leaned against her mother's shoulder, but despite being 17 and fiercely independent, she still sought this physical connection, this reassurance that they were in this together. "Mom, can I ask you something that might be uncomfortable?" "Always." "Do you think you would have been happy if he'd stayed? If Daniel had never left? If you'd never known about the fortune? If you'd just lived a normal middle-class life with a normal marriage and a normal family?" Olivia considered this carefully because Catherine deserved an honest answer, not a comfortable one. "I think I would have been content, maybe even happy in a limited way. But I wouldn't have been this." She gestured to the ballroom behind them, to the city below them, to the life they'd built together. "I wouldn't have understood what I was capable of. I wouldn't have learned what real strength feels like. I wouldn't have raised you the way I did, and I definitely wouldn't have helped 12,000 families escape the same circumstances we could have been trapped in." "So you're grateful he left?" Catherine asked. "I'm grateful for where his leaving led us," Olivia clarified. "I'm not grateful for the pain, the humiliation, the fear, but I'm grateful that those experiences taught me something essential about who I am and what I value. Your grandmother orchestrated it that way. She understood that some lessons can only be learned through fire." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, but when she spoke again, her voice held a determination that reminded Olivia of herself at 17, standing in that hospital room, inserting a USB drive that would change everything. "I want to write a book," Catherine said, "about Grandma Catherine, about you, about what happened and what we built afterward. Not for money, all proceeds would go to the foundation, but for the lesson, because I think there are people out there who need to know that betrayal isn't the end of the story, that abandonment isn't permanent defeat, that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the catalyst for the best thing you do." Olivia pulled her daughter closer, but tears were streaming down her face freely now. "Your grandmother would love that. She always said the real fortune wasn't the money, it was the lesson, and you're ready to teach it." "We'll teach it together," Catherine corrected. "Your story, my perspective, Grandma's strategy, all of it woven together to show people that circumstances don't define you, but your response to them does." 18 months later, The Fortune She Hid, 3 generations of women who chose purpose over privilege, debuted at #1 on every bestseller list. But the real impact came from the stories people shared after reading it. Stories of their own betrayals, their own abandonments, their own moments of discovering strength they didn't know they possessed. The book tour took Olivia and Catherine to 30 cities in 3 months. But the most meaningful stop was the small hospital in their hometown, where everything had begun 13 years ago. They had arranged to meet there at Olivia's request, but she hadn't told Catherine why until they were standing outside, The same fourth-floor window where Olivia had watched Daniel leave with Jessica all those years ago. "I stood right here," Olivia said quietly, her hand pressed against the glass. 7 months pregnant. My mother dead for 16 hours. My husband walking away with his mistress. And I remember thinking that this was the lowest point of my entire life, that there was nowhere to go but up from here, but I couldn't see how to get there. Catherine stood beside her mother, but through the window they could now see a completely different scene. The hospital had been renovated, modernized, expanded, with a new wing that bore a discreet plaque, the Catherine E. Thornton Memorial Wing, funded by the Thornton Foundation. "Grandma Catherine knew you'd find your way up," Catherine said. "That's why she left you the instructions. That's why she gave you Robert Chen's contact. That's why she timed everything so precisely. She turned your lowest moment into your launching point." "And now we're turning that launching point into a legacy," Olivia added. "The hospital wing treats uninsured patients for free. The Future Fund sends 100 kids to college every year. The medical debt relief program has helped 50,000 families, and this book," she held up a copy of their bestseller, "is teaching people that they can do the same thing in their own circumstances." A nurse walked past behind them, but she did a double take and then approached with nervous excitement. "Excuse me, are you Olivia Thornton? And Catherine, I just finished your book. I work in this hospital, and I had no idea this was where your story began." "Right here," Olivia confirmed, gesturing to the window. "Worst day of my life happened in a room down this hallway." The nurse's eyes filled with tears, but she spoke quickly, as if afraid she'd lose her nerve. "My husband left me when I was 6 months pregnant, 3 years ago. I was standing in this same hospital, looking at bills I couldn't pay, wondering how I'd survive. And then the Thornton Foundation covered everything. The delivery, the postnatal care, even 3 months of living expenses while I recovered. You saved my life, Mrs. Thornton. You saved my daughter's life. And I didn't even know you were the woman who'd stood in this same hospital, facing the same fear years before." Catherine stepped forward impulsively and hugged the nurse, but Olivia joined them, and the 3 women stood there in the hospital corridor while other staff and patients moved around them, creating a moment of connection that proved everything Olivia's mother had believed. That pain shared becomes purpose, that struggle survived becomes strength, that betrayal transformed becomes blessing. 5 years later, Catherine's college graduation from Harvard fell on a bright Saturday in May, but the real celebration happened afterward, in a private room at the hotel, where Olivia had arranged for a surprise that even her remarkably perceptive daughter hadn't anticipated. "Mom, this is already too much," Catherine protested as she entered the room to find not just family and friends, but also 50 recipients of the Thornton Future Fund Scholarship, students whose lives had been changed by the program Catherine had designed when she was just 17 years old. "It's not too much," Olivia said. "It's exactly right, because you need to see what you created, not just in theory, not just in annual reports, but in reality. These are the people whose lives are different because you decided that your pain, being abandoned before you were born, could become other people's purpose." One by one, the scholarship recipients shared their stories, but each one followed a similar pattern. Single parent, financial crisis, academic potential, then the Thornton Future Fund intervention that changed everything. A young woman who was now starting medical school, a young man who'd just been accepted into a PhD program in engineering, a non-binary student who'd published their first novel, a first-generation college graduate who was returning to their community to teach. Catherine listened to each story with tears streaming down her face, but when the last student finished, she stood and addressed them all with the composure Olivia had watched her develop over 22 years. "My grandmother set this in motion before I was born," Catherine said. "My mother carried it forward after betrayal that should have broken her. But you, All of you are the proof that it worked. That pain can become purpose. That betrayal can become blessing. That the worst thing that happens to you doesn't have to define you. It can refine you instead. She paused, but her next words were directed at Olivia. Mom, I have something to tell you. I've been offered a position at the foundation, Executive Director of Youth Programs. Robert Chen thinks I'm ready to take on more responsibility, and I've decided to accept. I'm not going to pursue corporate law like I planned. I'm going to spend my life doing this, turning our family's story into other families' salvation. Olivia felt her mother's presence more strongly than she had in years, but she understood now what Catherine Elizabeth Thornton had understood 30 years ago when she'd made the decision to live poor while secretly rich. That the greatest legacy isn't what you accumulate, it's what you teach. And what she'd taught across 3 generations, through poverty and wealth, through betrayal and triumph, through abandonment and abundance, was finally bearing fruit that would nourish people for generations to come. Present day, 20 years after the abandonment. The documentary premiered on a Tuesday evening, but by Wednesday morning it had been viewed 43 million times and had sparked conversations across every social media platform, every news outlet, every dinner table in America. The $100 billion lesson, how 3 women turned betrayal into the world's most impactful foundation, traced the entire story from Catherine Elizabeth Thornton's secret life, through Olivia's abandonment, through Catherine's leadership of the foundation's expansion. But the final segment was what made it go truly viral. The filmmakers had tracked down Daniel Whitmore and Jessica Parker, now divorced from each other, living separate ordinary lives in different cities, and asked them both the same question. Knowing what you know now, what would you change? Daniel's response was brutally honest. Everything. I would change everything. I threw away the most valuable thing I could have had, not the money, though that hurts to think about, but the chance to be Catherine's father, to be part of something meaningful. I chose comfort over character, and I've spent 20 years living with that choice. But it was Jessica's response that broke the internet. I destroyed a pregnant woman's life for a man who turned out to be exactly who he showed himself to be when he abandoned his pregnant wife. I have a son who will grow up knowing his father is capable of that kind of betrayal. And meanwhile, Catherine Thornton is out there changing thousands of lives every year. The math isn't even close. I chose wrong, and the universe made sure I understood exactly how wrong. The documentary ended with footage of Catherine, now 22, poised, powerful, purposeful, speaking at the Foundation's 20th anniversary gala. My grandmother lived poor to teach my mother about character. My biological father abandoned my mother to teach me about choice. My mother built this foundation to teach the world about transformation. And I'm going to spend my life proving that the lesson worked, that betrayal can become blessing, that pain can become purpose, that the worst thing that happens to you can become the catalyst for the best thing you do. The camera panned to Olivia in the audience, but her expression held everything that mattered. Pride in her daughter, grief for her mother, gratitude for the journey that had led them here, and absolute certainty that Catherine Elizabeth Thornton's 30-year plan had succeeded beyond anything even she could have imagined. That night, Olivia stood alone in her study, but the photograph on her desk had been updated. Now it showed 2 women, Olivia and Catherine, standing beneath a portrait of Catherine Elizabeth Thornton, 3 generations of strength captured in a single image. Her phone buzzed with a message from Catherine. Mom, I just got off the phone with the documentary team. They're reporting that the foundation received $47 million in unsolicited donations in the past 24 hours. $47 million, the exact amount of hospital debt you were facing 20 years ago. The universe has a sense of humor. Olivia smiled through tears, but she typed back, Your grandmother would say that's not the universe's sense of humor, that's mathematics. You put good into the world, The world eventually returns it multiplied. She called it the only investment strategy that matters. Catherine's response came immediately. Then we're the wealthiest poor girls who ever lived, because we invested in people and they're paying dividends in ways that can't be counted in dollars. Love you, Mom. See you tomorrow at the foundation board meeting. Olivia set her phone down, but she pulled out the letter one more time. The one her mother had written, the one she'd read hundreds of times over 20 years, the one that still had the power to make her cry. But this time, she noticed something she'd never seen before. A final paragraph written in pencil, so faint she'd missed it in every previous reading, added in her mother's shakiest handwriting, P.S. If you're reading this final paragraph, it means you've read this letter so many times that you finally looked closely enough to see what I hid here. Good. That means you understand that the real treasures are always hidden in plain sight. You just have to keep looking, keep learning, keep growing. I hid $100 billion from the world for 30 years, but the real treasure I left you wasn't money. It was the lesson that character is the only currency that appreciates forever. Love you always, baby. I'm proud of who you became. Mom Olivia pressed the letter against her heart, but she finally understood the complete scope of what her mother had done. She'd hidden a fortune to teach a lesson, orchestrated a betrayal to prove a point, and left instructions that would transform 3 generations of women into proof that the worst thing that happens to you doesn't have to be the end of your story. It can be the beginning of your purpose. 20 years after Daniel Whitmore had refused to pay his pregnant wife's hospital bills and left with his mistress, unaware she'd just inherited a $100 billion fortune, Olivia finally understood what had crushed him wasn't what she'd done to him. It was what she'd done without him, and that made all the difference.